Good evening.
Good evening.
There we go. So we are covering an entire chapter tonight, but that chapter is only 5 verses. So, we're technically, every book that we've covered, I have done as many lessons as there have been chapters. We are technically, I think, behind on Hosea because I split up kind of the first and second chapters oddly. And we're not going to catch up tonight, even though if I was going to do a catch up, this would be a good night to do it because, one chapter only has 5 verses. But we're only sticking with chapter 5 because there is a lot here. When we're covering chapter 3, we're jumping back into the narrative of Hosea's life that we started in chapter 1. For simplicity's sake, the unnamed woman that he marries, I'm just going to refer to as Gomer, right? We don't know if it wasn't, but for simplicity's sake, she's Gomer. And, week 1, we covered a lot of not necessarily Hosea's relationship with Gomer, but a lot of the significance in the kids, right? You have Jezreel, you have, not my people, you have no mercy or no compassion. And we talked a lot about the significance in that, how that was, fulfilled, the sort of prophecy was fulfilled later on, how, the certain words that were used would have meant a lot to the original audience. But what's interesting about chapter 3 is that it doesn't focus on Hosea and Gomer's children, but it focuses on Hosea and Gomer's relationship. So you actually get a lot more of the whole, adultery language that's being applied to Israel. So anyway, with that out of the way, we're just going to go ahead and read the very short chapter 3, starting in verse 1. Then the Lord said to me, "Go again, love a woman who is loved by a lover and is committing adultery, just like the love of the Lord for the children of Israel, who look to other gods and love the raisin cakes of the pagans. So I bought her for myself for 15 shekels of silver and 1.5 homers of barley. And I said to her, You shall stay with me many days, you shall not play the harlot, nor shall you have a man. So too will I be towards you. For the children of Israel shall abide many days without king or prince, without sacrifice or sacred pillar, without ephod or teraphim. Afterward the children of Israel shall return and seek the Lord their God and David their king. They shall fear the Lord and his goodness in the latter days." So, just kind of breaking it down, verse 1, verses 2 and 3, and verses 4 and 5. So we do have a pretty similar description of Israel's sin that we've already kind of seen, especially in chapter 1. But, there's some added bits of detail that we don't get from the previous chapters. And if you're like me, you really don't understand at all, right? You have the added bit about Israel loving the raisin cakes of pagans, right? This is before Paul came along and said that it's okay to eat meat sacrificed to idols. So, if you're alive in Hosea's time and you're eating raisin cakes of pagans, that's a big no-no, right? And, in and of themselves, raisin cake, ain't nothing wrong with having some raisin cake. Don't know that I've ever had raisin cake myself personally, but there's nothing about the ingredients themselves that, would violate the Old Covenant food laws. But, right, what is bad about this is that these cakes have become a part of pagan worship. And, it says that, right, the raisin cakes of the pagans, and then historically we know, right, a lot of these, gods that, Baal, for instance, fertility gods, it was all part of the worship of, you go through these rituals, right? Prepare these cakes kind of a thing in hopes of being blessed by the pagan gods. So these cakes have become part of pagan worship. In 2 Samuel chapter 6, when the Ark of the Covenant was brought to Jerusalem by David, something that might stick out to you was part of the festivities. It says, they brought the Ark of the Lord, and they set it in its place inside the tent that David had pitched for it. And David sacrificed burnt offerings and fellowship offerings before the Lord. And after he had finished sacrificing the burnt offerings and the fellowship offering, he blessed the people in the name of the Lord Almighty. He gave them a loaf of bread, a cake of dates, and a cake of raisins to each person in the whole crowd of Israelites, both men and women, and all the people went to their homes. So, once again, in and of themselves, these cakes, there's nothing bad about them. And what's interesting is that these cakes, in times past, had actually been used to glorify God. They were part of, covenantal, God-honoring worship and festivities. And so the same food that had once been used in worship to God is now being used in worship to idols. And by the very same nation, right? It's not just that, Israel uses these cakes to worship God, and then, the Philistines, they use those same cakes to worship, the Baals or whatever. No, it was Israel, one generation, they're using these cakes, thanking God for, the ark and, bringing it to Jerusalem. And, a couple generations later, they're using these cakes to worship pagan gods. And so the parallel with Hosea's life, there's sort of, the general prostituting that Gomer has committed. And obviously, there's a very obvious parallel there to, right, Gomer is an adulteress, Israel is idolatrous. But what is the parallel with the whole raisin cake thing? The parallels are sort of broken down as, like I said, Gomer commits adultery, Israel commits idolatry. Gomer loves evil, and Israel loves pagan cake. And the whole loving evil thing is the whole love a woman who is loved by a lover could also be translated as love a woman who is loved by evil. And that's the translation that the Septuagint, the Greek translation, goes with. And, there's sort of an argument about, which is right, which is wrong. But if you're trying to draw a parallel, that makes a little bit more sense. Right? Gomer is called a lover of evil, and Israel is a lover of these pagan cakes, more specifically, the rituals that go along with worshiping these pagan gods. Right? The problem is not just that Israel worship other gods, but that Israel loves the elements of the worship of other gods, right? They love the pagan bread. And if you remember in chapter 2, there was the description of elements of Baal worship, right? It says, I will go after my lovers who give me my bread, who give me my water, my wool, my linen, my oil, and my drink, right? These temple prostitutes, basically, right? They survived off of other people giving them this stuff. And so, right, Israel was in love with not just, I throw a couple shekels of silver at the statue of Baal or whatever, but they were actually in love with the elements of worship of these pagan gods, right? In the same way that we as Christians should be in love, not just with God, God, I'll throw a prayer up to you when I need something, but we should be in love with the elements of worship, right? We should be in love with prayer. We should be in love with singing songs to God. We should be in love with Christian fellowship, right? That's the relationship that Israel had to all of the elements that went into pagan worship, right? At this point, we talked about the sort of syncretism that Israel had, where they were apparently, combining worship of the true God with worship of pagan gods into one sort of weird mixture of a religion. Well, they apparently have now moved beyond just syncretism into, right, all of the elements used in idolatry, right? I mean, they're in love with, they're infatuated with, right? Israel, just like Gomer, right? This is your blank, right? Israel, were in love with evil, right? Not just idolatry itself, but all the elements involved in idolatry. And then they, just like Gomer, loved evil itself. But God, just like Hosea, loves Israel. So your first blank is evil. Israel was in love with evil, which is also, right, your second blank. But, evil, and then all of the elements used in idolatry. Third blank is also evil, and then but God, just like Hosea, loves Israel, right? Hosea, even though his wife was in love with evil, he loved her anyway. God, even though Israel is in love with evil, and not just idolatry, but all the elements involved in that, God still loves Israel anyway. So this brings up something that I think is pretty interesting, which is, well, we'll get into verses 2 and 3. So verses 2 and 3, your next section. Right, we talked about how even though Gomer loved evil, Hosea loved her anyway, and he pays the description in verse 2. I bought her for myself 15 shekels of silver and 1.5 homers of barley. So, I did the math. I did the math. The Masoretic text, which the New King James is based off of, actually reads, if you were just doing like a straight translation, it says a homer of barley and a lethek of barley. But here's the thing. No one actually knows what that word is, or even if that is a word at all. Some people argue that it is a miscopy. Whoever was copying, the original, that wasn't even the word that was used. Because we have no idea what this is from anything else in the Bible or anything historically. It's been assumed that it's equal to half of a homer. So that's why the New King James translates it as, verse 2, a 1.5 homers of barley. But even then, that is just pure speculation. The Septuagint translates it as 15 pieces of silver, a homer of barley, and a jar of wine, which you can get with the Septuagint with rearranging a couple things, because Hebrew is a very complicated language. So assuming that that's what it is, for simplicity's sake, we got 15 shekels of silver, a homer of barley, and a jar of wine. All right, I did the math on all this in today's money, of course. A homer is about roughly 5 bushels. And right, I did not know what the heck a bushel was, so I had to Google that. According to the all-wise Google, yeah, I know. Laugh all you want. I don't know, man. I grew up in the city. All right, I didn't grow up with no bushels of barley. All right.
We know what a bushel is, don't we?
I know that song, hide it under a bushel. No, I'm going to let it shine. Other than that, I don't know.
There's bushels of wheat, there's bushels of apples,
Yeah.
bushels of peaches.
See, y'all know. I don't know what it is. But Google says for barley, it's about 48 pounds. This is according to Google. I don't know. So,
Wheat, 52?
It's heavier than that.
yeah.
Every commodity weighs differently.
Well, yeah, because it's volumetric as opposed to just pure weight. But anyway, so according to Google, a bushel or 48 pounds worth of barley in today's dollars is about $7. Again, according to Google, multiply that by 5. 5 bushels equals 1 homer, roughly. That's $35 just for the whole homer of barley. Not too bad, right? This is this is an affordable, marriage arrangement. Assuming once again that it's a jug of wine and not another half of a barley. I just Googled jug of wine on the internet, right? That's always a dangerous thing to be Googling. And, I don't know. I'm not like a wine connoisseur, so this is probably like bottom shelf level stuff. But Google pulled up I can buy a 4-liter jug of wine for $20. Not bad, right? We're at $55 so far. Heck, if I could find a wife for $55, I'd probably take them up on that offer as well. And then all that's left is the shekels, right? So the word shekel is technically not actually in the text. It would just say like 15 pieces of silver, although everyone's in agreement that shekel is what is being referred to. A shekel is roughly, or at least back then, right, different from the modern day shekel, of course, roughly 11 grams. So in today's money, 11 grams of silver will run you 91, let me see. Yeah, 1 gram of silver is 91.91. Yes, what is it? 91 cents, I guess. Although that doesn't make any sense.
More like $91.
No, not for a gram of silver. An ounce of silver is only like $28.
Okay.
Anyway, it's one of those things where like I wrote all this out, but like my math is even confusing me. Anyway, the point is 11 grams of silver today will run you about $10. So not bad. Hosea paid 15 shekels, so 15 times the 10. He basically paid about $150 worth of silver in today's money, of course. So $150 cash, $20 worth of wine, and $35 worth of barley. All in all, about $205 spent for a wife. Again, that ain't bad. And this is kind of goofy, but this kind of thing still happens today. College I went to, we had a lot of international students, and there was one guy who was from, I believe, Madagascar. I was not very close to him. We didn't have any of the same classes. We didn't really run in the same social circle, but I just know he just kind of disappeared. I didn't know what happened to him. Like, I lived in the dorm for 4 years. He moved out of the dorm. I just assumed he got an apartment. Apparently, he went back home for an entire semester. Came back, was engaged. Not only that, but he owed the father some goats and some whatever, chickens or something. I was like, man, I feel like we're reverting back to biblical times. And it was kind of funny, but I mean, that is the culture, in some places.
It still goes on in a lot of third world countries.
It does, yeah. I mean, it's more common than you would think because, yeah, we don't hear about that here, but it is in other places very common.
In some Bibles, you have a chart. This Bible has a chart of dry measures, weights, measures of lengths, dry measures, and liquid measures.
Yeah.
In your Bible, you might have a chart that tells you how much all that is.
Yeah. The only problem is we don't know.
If that's true.
Well, I was going to say we can figure out how much. Do what?
It's probably as true as Google.
This is true. Well, the thing about it is because I'm doing all this in today's dollars. So the thing is we can figure out, a homer is roughly this in today's measurements, but we don't exactly know how much a homer sold for back then. So I could only use Google to figure out how much it would be worth today and do it all based off of today's dollars. So you know what I'm saying? The chart is helpful for figuring out in terms of strict weight measurement, back then to today, but like there's not really an accurate way of figuring out like in 700 BC dollar amount how much this total would have cost.
My Bible has a footnote that says that he bought him for half the usual price of a slave.
And we're gonna get to that. I said, and we're gonna get to that. Ding, ding, ding.
You're right.
So you're still just guessing. We're just guessing then at how much it was. I mean, because
I was doing this all in today's dollars, right? I'm not claiming that he paid.
What it boils down to wasn't enough.
Yeah, that's the point that I'm getting to. The point is, right, like you said, it wasn't a lot of money, right? In today's dollars, if you just went out and bought all this stuff, right? Like I said, you're running about $205. Back then, we don't exactly know, because again, we don't know what this stuff sold for back then, but it wasn't a lot, right? It's not going to be drastically more or less expensive than what I just quoted. And then to get on to what you said, Exodus 21, verse 32, it says, if a bull gores a male or female slave, the owner must pay 30 shekels of silver to the master of the slave, and the bull is to be stoned to death. So a slave, the life of a slave was valued at, twice as much, basically, I guess, just at a shekel value anyway, twice as much as what Gomer's life was valued for whoever was selling her. Right? And that is, your point, Gomer's valued at less than a slave, right? She is essentially worthless, right? And that's the point. That's the emphasis, right?
And this Bible says it was probably from a slave auction.
Yeah, I mean, so there's a couple different, and I think I noted that somewhere. There are a couple different things. It's like he either bought her from her new husband. The problem then becomes there's not really a precedent for that elsewhere in Scripture. Bought her from basically like her pimp, which prostitutes were basically slaves, so that's kind of the same thing. And that's probably most likely, or like bought her from, I forget what the other one was. I don't know. There's a couple different things, but yeah, it probably was basically the slave owner, or what we would call like a pimp, basically. Like, okay, you're a prostitute and I own you, and any revenue you make, I'm taking most of that. Right. She's basically worthless, and right, she's valued at less than a slave. And then going on into verse 3, she's told to stay home and remain pure. Not just stay home and don't, go prostituting with strangers, but even Hosea ain't going to touch her, right? And even this, there's different views surrounding this, right? Was this a permanent thing, right? Did Gomer and Hosea never have sex again? Was this a temporary thing, right? Okay, I'm going to buy you back. I'm going to bring you in. But, I'm going to institute a little bit of time of, kind of like when you're a kid, go to your room and reflect on your bad choices kind of a thing. Right? Or, I mean, some people, depending on how you, translate the text, some people said Hosea bought her back and they just immediately went back to being fully married in every sense of the word. But, right, I mean, given the last two verses and the parallel that's being drawn between the sort of living sermon illustration of Hosea and Gomer and, right, God's relationship with Israel, really, I mean, the only option is, okay, there's sort of this brief time of, like I said, go to your room and think about what you did kind of a thing. And then eventually, I'm going to bring you back and love you. And so that brings us to verses 4 and 5, which, again, are directed specifically at Israel, right? Gomer is going to live with Hosea. She's not going to play the harlot, right? And Israel, it says, just as Gomer for many days was told to stay at home, Israel for many days would live without a ruler, and they would live without worship. But this was not a permanent situation for Israel, right? And so if it's not a permanent situation for Israel, it's probably not a permanent situation for Gomer and Hosea either. Because verse 5 clarifies that afterward, Israel would seek God. And afterward, Israel would fear God, right? God's intention in the end is to love a pure Israel. That's something that I'm going to bring up several times, but because this is the first time I brought it up, you can just go ahead and mark that down on your blank. God's intention is to love a pure Israel, right? The point is never, the point is never to just punish and then ignore, right? It's like with your kid, right? You've all had children, and you never just, hopefully anyway, punish your child and then you just ignore them, right? Oh, you broke the window, well, you're grounded and you're not allowed to go anywhere, and right, I'm just going to lock you in your bedroom for the next 20 years and I'm never going to talk to you again, right? No, your point is to, right, correct them and then love them, right? And that's the same. That's what Hosea does to Gomer. That's what God does to Israel. So looking at verse 4 and 5, there's a couple things that might need clarification. And I think the first one is, it's your point A, sacrifice and sacred pillar. All right. Obviously, sacrifice, that's a reference to one of the main acts of Israelite worship, animal sacrifice, right? We're all familiar with that. It's the whole sacred pillar thing that can be a little less clear. Sacred pillars were often part of pagan places of worship. And oftentimes they represented whatever god the temple or altar was dedicated to, right? I'm going to an altar to one of the Baals, and there's a pillar. It's supposed to represent Baal, something along those lines. At the end of Deuteronomy chapter 16, we see the words that say, "Do not set up any wooden Asherah pole beside the altar you build to the Lord your God." And this is important. "And do not erect a sacred stone, for the Lord your God hates these," right? So we see in Hosea, once again, this syncretism of, we have the sacrificial system, that's been handed down. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and Moses, and David, and all these people, that have, brought us to where we are, with the sacrificial system. And we keep that, and we do that, and we like that. But we also have these, pillars that are dedicated to other gods. And we also like that, right? Even says that we love those things, right? And very soon, Hosea says, both of those are going to be taken away, right? Not just, I'm going to take away, your sacred pillars and you're not going to be able to worship false gods, but even, right, your sacrificial system, even your sacrifices. Verse 4, "For the children of Israel shall abide many days, ... without sacrifice or sacred pillar," right? Because of the blending of these two, right, true religion and false religion, right, both of them would be taken away. And ultimately, right, we see this in the exile, right? And we sort of got into that last week in terms of, a lot of what Hosea prophesies about is only possible in an exile situation. Point B, we have the ephod and the teraphim. Once again, we all kind of are familiar with the ephod. I mean, this is, if you've ever seen a drawing or a diagram of the Levitical priesthood, right? We're all sort of familiar with that. It's got the gemstones in it and the funny looking hat and all of that, right? We're all sort of familiar on that end of things. But there's something that I think is important to point out about the ephod. It held I didn't actually write it down, but it's called the Urim and the Thummim, I think. And these were basically used for divination, right? Not the evil, satanic kind, but just, right, seeking the Lord's guidance, right? God essentially working through these objects to provide wisdom and guidance and direction for the Levitical priesthood. And then that ties into the teraphim, because the teraphim, throughout the Old Testament, you have different forms of the same word being used. And in a lot of instances, it's translated as household idols, right? If you come across in the Old Testament something that says household idols, you can Google whatever verse you're on, and then the word interlinear, and it'll show you, right, the actual Hebrew word that's used, and it's most likely a form of teraphim. It just has a different prefix or suffix, and you don't have to know Greek because it will tell you in English what the word would spell out to be. So I mean, most of the time, I mean, it's just translated as household idols. And in the other examples in the Old Testament where it says something about, household idols or whatever, it's always in reference to divination, but not the kind that the Levitical priesthood did, right? Not the I'm calling upon God and asking for his wisdom, right? Always, right, the bad kind, the satanic kind. A couple different examples, right? Ezekiel 21, verse 21, it says, "The king of Babylon will stop at the fork in the road, at the junction of the two roads, to seek an omen. And he will cast lots with arrows, and he will consult his idols." Same word, right? It has the prefix bat, B-A-T, and then the rest of the word is just literally teraphim. It's the same word that's used in Hosea. Zechariah chapter 10, verse 2, which you should be familiar with because that's another minor prophet. It says, "The idols speak deceitfully. Diviners seek visions that lie. They tell dreams that are false. They give comfort in vain. The people wander like sheep oppressed for the lack of shepherds." So the word for idols there is, again, teraphim, just with the suffix of U, or in a long U sound. So, right, the same word that, household idols, a lot of the time, depending on the translation, I think NIV translates it that way a lot. It's the same word as teraphim, but for whatever reason, when it comes to this, they just transliterated it out as teraphim, which is kind of confusing. But basically, right, idols that were used for divination, right, I'm calling upon this false god, wanting him to give me answers, wanting him to help me make a decision, right? I mean, you have the same stuff in satanic and pagan religion today, right? Very explicitly condemned in the Bible, Old and New Testament. These household idols, right? They were specifically forbidden, right? But Israel was calling upon these false gods, and once again, both the positive and the negative are going to be taken away. The Levitical priesthood and their divination, right? The ephod that held the Urim and Thummim, or however you pronounce that, which was used to call upon God and ask God for, decision making, that's going to be taken away. And the, what is the word? Teraphim and the household idols that are used to call upon false gods are going to be taken away. Just like the sacrificial system and the sacred pillars are going to be taken away. But God's intention in all of this, right? It's to love a pure Israel. That is your blank. God's intention is to love a pure Israel. The point is never to just punish and then ignore, right? The point is not, I'm going to punish you. I'm going to take away your sacrificial system. I'm going to take away your priesthood, right? I'm not gonna be available for you to, seek answers and guidance for, for whatever anymore, right? No, the point is, just like Hosea and Gomer, I'm going to buy you back, and there's going to be this time of redemption, right? Because that's a process, right? Just like when the first time that you you picking up on the marriage language, right? The first time that you meet someone, right? You're not immediately going to know everything about them. You're not going to know everything that they like and everything that they dislike. Most people don't have love at first sight, right? They have to kind of fall in love. And that's sort of the idea here, right? I'm buying Israel, and right, we're going to take things slow, right? You've done a lot that is obviously wrong. You have mixed the sacrificial system that I gave you with idol worship. You have mixed the Levitical priesthood that I gave you with idol worship. And so I'm not just going to immediately buy you back and then set you on your way, right? I'm going to buy you back, and there's going to be a time of mourning. There's going to be a time of repentance, and there's going to be a time of restoration. And that's a process. But Israel, right, they're going to be without a king, not just a king, right? It says a king or a prince, right? They're going to be without any ruler at all, right? Again, exile, right? Without a king, without the ability to make sacrifices, without the ability to consult their priests, and right, this was fulfilled in the exile. But verse 5, where you have sort of the reversal of all of this, was fulfilled in whole during the Messianic age, right? Because, the language that's used here, the children of Israel shall return and seek the Lord their God and David their king, right? This language of, right, the new David, the new and better King David, right? This is something that would get developed as the years go by, right? Prophets that would come on to the scene later would develop this idea. But even in Hosea's time, you see this idea of, right, a return to the Davidic line, in both a literal sense and sort of a symbolic sense, because David was always sort of the gold standard, right? David, the days of David and Solomon, those were the heydays, man. Why can't we get back to that, right? But also, in the literal sense of, right, Jesus being of the line of David. You have, right, the fulfillment of verse 4 in the exile, and then verse 5 fully fulfilled in Jesus Christ. And we talked about, right, how people from the north, people from the south, people who were previously not God's people, right, the Gentiles, everyone would worship, right, Jesus Christ, or all different types of people would worship Jesus Christ during the Messianic age, and even now in the church age. And this is sort of the same idea at play here in chapter 3, right? You have the children of Israel returning and seeking the Lord their God and David their king, and they shall fear the Lord and his goodness in the latter days. this is Israel, but this is also us. I mean, this is also every person ever who has placed faith in Jesus Christ, which sort of leads into our application of, okay, if this whole chapter is sort of about the syncretism of, Israel, true worship of God with these pagan or idolatrous practices, in what ways do Christians today syncretize idolatrous practices with, that's supposed to say, like, I don't know what word I meant to put there, because it says, in what ways do Christians syncretize idolatrous practices with religious practices? I think that's supposed to say, like, idolatrous practices with biblical practices or something, but you get the idea. In what ways are we syncretizing, right? I got a couple things that I'll just point out. Number one, right? The church should not be run like a business, right? You see this a lot today, and I think it's unfortunate. There are elements of running a business that go into operating the church. I mean, obviously, we have committees that decide business type of stuff, obviously, we have to keep the lights on. Obviously, we have business meetings, but there's always the spiritual element that should take precedence over any, marketing campaign or any sort of, fundraising strategy or business decision, anything like that, right? The spiritual element of, okay, well, here's sort of what makes sense on paper, but let's ask, what does God want us to do? That should always take precedence, right? Other religions are very much concerned with pragmatism, right? Does the end justify the means, right? Don't judge me based on my methods. Judge me based on my results, right? Do I do something that's unethical? Maybe, but can I get people to show up to my church? Absolutely. So what I'm doing is justified. That's the way that the world thinks, right? But the true church, right, the true people of God, we should not be like that, right? And I think too often we're kind of like Israel, right? We're holding on to, well, we're worshiping God, or we claim to be worshiping God anyway, but we want to hold on to, right, what works, right? What's going to get the most number of people in the pews or the chairs in our case as possible, right? And we sort of completely ignore the whole spiritual aspect of, okay, yeah, I mean, that makes sense on paper, but what does God actually want us to do? How is the Holy Spirit actually leading this church? And I think that that's unfortunate. The second thing I pulled out of this is I think the church should not be some sort of exclusive club, right? I don't know. I don't like bashing other churches. So I'm going to speak very generic, very broad terms. I'm not calling out any one church. But you have churches that are like very oddly specific, right? This is the biker church. This is the cowboy church. And it's like, why can't we just be a church for everyone, regardless of what your hobby is? The requirements for church membership are faith and baptism. It's not your, gender, your race, your age, your political beliefs, what kind of motorized vehicle you drive or whatever. Right? Other religions, they focus on these external things. Right? But Jesus says, right? It's the internal that matters. It's not these external things. And I think a lot of the times, we focus too much on, what do we want our church to look like in terms of the kind of people we want to draw, right? Well, I want to draw, upper class, middle age, white Republicans in my church, right? And we think about that more so than I want to draw lost people to my church. I want to draw people that are on fire for Jesus. I want to draw every nation, right? I want to bring the whole world in, right? And I think that that's unfortunate. Because if you look around, like I said, other religions, they are focused on recruiting. They're focused on recruiting people to the religion, right? I want the very best of the best, right? Like a college football team, right? We don't want Joe Schmo. We want Tom Brady to be quarterback in our team, right? But we're not a football team, right? Right? We're the church is supposed to be the underdogs. That's kind of the point. And then the third thing I picked up is I don't think that the church should become stagnant, right? The other religions, especially pagan or satanic religions, they focus on the tradition of their religion as much or more than they do the actual act of worship itself. And what I mean by that is, right, for a lot of not necessarily mainline religions, but again, like neo-paganism or whatever, the experience is not so much in the fact that I'm worshiping whatever pagan god I'm worshiping, but I'm, reciting this, ancient Germanic chant that has been used to call upon the Germanic gods for thousands of years, right? And it's about the tradition aspect over the actual religion. As to how we sort of, do that same thing in churches, I think sometimes churches can become so concerned with the fact that, we're, reading this prayer, from, that was written, 500 years ago, right? I mean, and we don't do this necessarily in Baptist churches, but other denominations do this, right? And it's more the fact that it's a tradition than this is an actual worshipful moment for me, and I'm expressing my heart to God the Father. Or even, music, right? We don't actually have a liturgy. And in a way, that's probably a little disappointing, but in a way, it's a good thing, right? We do not have a mandated, these are the songs that you must play. Do not play anything else besides these songs, right? Not that that is necessarily what a liturgy is, but right, for a lot of churches, high church, we have the whole ecclesiastical system thing going on. A lot of what they sing, it's less about the fact that it's an actual worshipful moment for them. And, well, this is what my church has been singing for, 1,500 years, right? I'm singing this Latin chant, not because I know Latin, and not because my heart is just overflowing with joy for God when I sing this Latin chant, but because this is what my church has been singing for as long as my church has been a thing, right? And it's too much of, right, the tradition and not enough of actually worshiping in spirit and truth, right? We focus on the tradition more than the object of our worship, which is Jesus Christ. We worship the time rather than the timeless, right? So anyway, anything else anyone wants to throw out for the application or just anything else that we've talked about?
Can you define syncretism for me?
Yes. So, right, you've heard of like synchronizing clocks.
Yes.
Same principle, right? So you have two things that at one point, right, that clock, this clock is 6:52, that clock is 6:52. They're synchronized. Pretend that clock up there is 8:30, right? Before they were synchronized, they were two completely different things, right? It was doing its thing. This is doing its thing. When we synchronize them, they're running together. In religion, right, syncretism is, okay, I have one religion that ordinarily would say something completely different than another religion. But I'm going to take a little bit of this and a little bit of this and sort of mix it together and basically make a whole nother religion out of the two. Yeah. And I mean, this is very common with people who they never really were a part of either religion that they're syncretizing, which I think is kind of ironic. But sort of the whole, all roads lead to God kind of philosophy that has come about in the last 100 years. This is popular, right? Well, I'll take the least offensive parts of Christianity. I'll take the least offensive parts of Islam. I'll take the least offensive parts of Hinduism and whatever else and just sort of mash them together. And, next thing you know, I've got the coexist bumper sticker on my car. And,
Next thing you know, you don't know what you're doing.
Exactly, right. And in a way, that's sort of the whole point, right? I don't have to fully commit to any one idea. And by doing that, I'm, in my mind, covering all of my bases without actually having to put in any of the effort. Although no one will actually admit to doing that. But anyway.
They end up not knowing what they actually believe.
Yeah. Yeah.
In my Bible, I don't have anything that refers to raisin cakes.
What is yours actually? How does it translate that?
Flagons of wine.
And verse 1?
Mm-hmm.
I don't even know what a flagoon is.
I suppose it's a container of some kind. I don't know. But that's what it says.
I would say it's some kind of jug.
Yeah. I guess it could be an animal skin.
Word of the day, flagoon.
Yeah. That's what it says.
Is that our homework, to look up the meaning of flagoon?
Yeah, come back next week and make me feel really dumb that I didn't know what a flagoon was.
What translation is it? King James?
Yeah.
The sacred.
You kept talking about raisin cakes, and I couldn't find any raisin cakes. I was trying to see what my tradition is or anything here.
I mean, it would be based off of the same text as what I'm reading from.
Yeah.
So
it just says containing Old and New Testament authorization or authorized King James Version. Edited by C.I. Schofield. Does that tell you anything?
Well, that's just who wrote the footnotes. He wouldn't be the actual translator. I don't know.
That's what it says.
How do you spell that word?
Well, in mine, the reference is to that 2 Samuel chapter 6, verse 19 for the raisin cakes. That's what you're quoting.
Pull up. What? 2 Samuel what?
6:19.
Can you pull that up in the King James? So I'm just 2 Samuel chapter 6.
Is it?
What did you say it was?
A flagoon of wine.
Flagon. 2 Samuel what? I lost my thoughts.
6:19.
You read earlier 6:19, it's like the same.
My translation says, then he gave a loaf of bread, a cake of dates, and a cake of raisins to each person in the whole crowd of Israelites, both men and women.
Yeah, when I read it, most of the time, any additional verses I pull from are going to be NIV, and then the main text I read from the New King James. So when I read that, because you're NIV, right?
Yes.
Yeah, when I read it, I read from the NIV, so it's the same as what I read from.
6:19.
Yes. What does your King James say?
this first thing.
Oh, okay, and it says, and he dealt among all people, even among the whole multitude of Israel, as well as to the woman, as men, to everyone a cake of bread, and a good piece of flesh, and a flagon of wine.
Well, there you go. So even though, for reasons unknown to me,
It's spelled different than I thought. Flagon, flagon, like a flag.
for reasons unknown to me, the translators of the King James apparently went with flagon of wine instead of raisin cake. But the emphasis is still the same, that whatever this was, either raisin cake or wine,
Doesn't make any difference. It's the point.
yeah, the point remains the same, that this thing, whatever it was, that at one point was being used to worship God, in the time of Hosea is being used to worship idols. So, yeah, as to why they went with that translation, I have no idea. Because, I mean, the New King James is based off of the same text of the Hebrew as the King James, and they went with raisin cakes.
Well, I guess
So,
wine's made out of raisins, isn't it?
well,
Right.
Technically,
it's
grapes.
grapes. I mean, I guess it could
Well,
be made
grapes-
out of raisins.
Grapes are made out
The
grapes.
raisins are made out of grapes.
Yeah, there we go. Raisins
Yeah.
are made out of grapes.
I suppose, I don't know, can you ferment raisins to make wine?
I don't know.
I've never fermented anything to make wine, so I wouldn't know.
Don't you remember here several years ago they came out to ferment raisins in vodka or something like that and drink it for all kinds of ailments and you'll be cured?
Huh. No, I don't
Yeah, but
know.
they're not making wine out of the raisins there.
No.
They're mixing it with vodka.
Yuck.
Just having a
We're learning all sorts of stuff. Okay. Anything else? Questions or comments or anything? Any other weird translations? Okay.